Hello and welcome back to Genesis Designs and Modelcraft and the beginning of Bare Naked Build 2, and I've decided to go with the Italeri F-35 Lightning II first. I do have the Tamiya kit to do as well, but in order for me to be able to be as positive as possible about the Italeri one, I figured if I do it first I'm less likely to constantly compare it to the Tamiya one, and that could possibly be a little bit unfair or seem biased. So I'm going to do this one first, and it's time for a caveat. With the Revell Hurricane, that is a relatively inexpensive kit, and I did get a discount on it too, so it's not a massive loss financially speaking or monetarily speaking that I have a naked Hurricane sat in my photo booth right now. However, this one did actually cost a reasonable amount of money, and I would like to have a proper finished model after I've done this. So I want to provide this sort of review service to you, but I also want everything. Obviously, I'm a woman, so I am going to do the bare naked thing. However, if I get to a point anywhere in this build where I'm going to absolutely have to paint something to enable me to have a decent finished model afterwards, then I will do it. I probably won't detail it, but if you do suddenly find sort of, let's say, lift fan areas painted randomly in the build, that'll be why. And no doubt I'll repeat myself at the when I get there anyway, because I do that a lot, I think. But yeah, let's get into this, see how she goes together, see what it looks like when it's done. This is what it looks like now. Obviously I took it all out of the bags already, but yeah, let's crack on and get into it, and I will pick this up at pertinent points and show you all the stages as I did with the Hurricane. Okay, so we're working on these two initial steps here for the cockpit seat and tub. So this is the tub, and I've joined this part on, but it wasn't quite right. If you can see in the drawing here, let's do a bit more zooming. See in the drawing here that this part has rounded corners. However, the part as moulded did not have rounded corners, so all I've done is I glued it in place and then dutifully rounded off the corners with the scalpel and the Stanley stick, just because it looked a little incongruous when fitted. So it fits from underneath, and it honestly fits like a glove. Absolutely beautiful. But the square edges of that part, which is reflecting now, would have looked really odd next to everything else, so I just rounded those off. But other than that, nothing really to speak of. There were some very, very slight, get the tweezers, sort of semicircles here and here of ejector pin marks, which I've just trimmed off with the scalpel. But what we'll look at now is the harness. So the harness for the seat is supplied as photo etch, so I'm just going to look at fitting that, but I'll show you first how to remove photo etched parts from the thread, which I've probably shown before, but I'm going to do it again anyway. So what you need is a firm surface. This is a piece of severely thick plasticard, probably 3mm thick plasticard. It's pretty firm, and this is what I use. So you take your etch and you place it on that nice and flat, and you're going to need a curved blade such as this. This is a number 15 Swan Morton. Number 10s could be used also. Basically anything with a curved blade, and you need to identify the place where you want to trim it. If you drag the blade sideways across the part where you know you need to cut, it will naturally click into the point where the thin area for cutting is. So once located, simply push that blade straight down. If it's a bit thick like this is, then you can rock it a little to help the process. There you go, and once it goes through you'll hear that click, so you know it's done it. The problem I've got here is that these edges are very tight to the piece of PE, so it's hard for the blade to get all the way through, even as small as it is. But don't cut, actually literally just push the blade downwards, and that way you won't distort the PE like you otherwise would. Which is also why you need that firm backing. If you tried to cut straight down or straight onto your cutting mat, you'll deflect everything downwards, it'll bend basically. So there we go, that's off and ready to fit. So that's a bit of a faff. This is quite thick and inflexible, this PE. It's always the problem with photo etch, and I do think for seat belts it's not necessarily the best material because of that. It looks a bit unanimated and flat. But anyway, once it's all bent into shape, that sits in there like so. I'm not super convinced by the layout here, but this is what the kit provides, so this is what we shall fit, and there you go, that's it in situ. I shall glue that and then finish assembling the seat. So here's our first fit issue then. So we've got 3 ejector pin circles so far, 2 on this back plate and 1 on part of the ejection seat. My first fit problem is with this blanking plate. So the instructions show here, step 2, this part here fits up into the fuselage half, and it's closing off this vent area. Fits in this orientation like so, but if you look at the area the part fits to, you can see that immediately next to this it sort of angles away, whereas this part just has a shelf, so there's no way that will ever fit properly in here without trimming. So I'm going to just do some trimming and get that fitting. Just make absolutely sure which bit it is. I can feel how you can feel it, just it rocks because it won't sit in there because of the area that needs addressing, and it's basically this ledge here that needs to go. So just trim it off with your scalpel. Thus, bring it down till it's flush with the ledge. And there it is. Sits in place nicely now. And that's all it took. Strange design choice by Italeri there. Clearly that isn't going to work as moulded, but there it is fitted. Alright, just like that we've got the cockpit in. Just tabs on from underneath. There's our little blanking plate in place there. I put black super glue around the back just to keep it solid. So you've got 2 pins there and 1 here, and it just pops up. I've just put some extra thin just in there, held it in place, and from the top we look like this. It is not bad at all. So I cleaned up the sills before I put the cockpit in, just a little bit of sort of moulding seam nonsense. We've got a piece of PE at the back there, that's just pre-bent so that it fits. That's held in with black super glue as well, and that's it. So the next step from there is actually fitting the upper wings. So an initial fit, you've just got a couple of pegs to locate, but it's clear where it goes. An initial fit, it didn't look perfect. Bear in mind this joint needs to not be there, it needs to be completely gone, absolutely disappear. And it wasn't bad, but it wasn't perfect. It needed shimming. Basically it was just wanting to sit a little bit lower than this surface, and you need it to be as close as possible. Let's say that's got to disappear, but it needs to be really, ideally, at the same level. And as you can see, it is now. You see how it keeps disappearing in the picture when I hold it just right, like so. That's how it needs to look, and I've achieved that by shimming. So you could shim with plastic card if you have the right sort of thicknesses, but I find that a little bit hit or miss, not least because the addition of the glue layer varies everything. So I actually use Tamiya tape a lot of the time and things like that. So in this instance, I have a couple of little shreds of Tamiya tape. We have 2 layers here and 1 layer there, and that's all it has taken just to get that to sit absolutely perfectly, or as close to it as you're going to get. There will always be a join there which will have to be addressed. There's no way around that, but you need it to be as flush and as level as possible before you start trying to get rid of it. If you've got big differences in the level, then your filling medium, whatever that will be, for me it will be super glue later on, has to extend onto one surface or the other, and it's just much more difficult to get a nice joint. As it is here, I'm effectively just filling a panel line, and that's how it needs to be. So that was 2 layers of Tamiya tape at the front and 1 layer of Tamiya tape at the back, probably a 5 thou and a 2 thou shim maybe. Really little amount, but made the difference. Okay, up as far as step 3, we had a good bit of progress, or apparent progress anyway. So I've added both the upper wings. Both were shimmed with Tamiya tape slices, as I showed you. That's the side I showed you, so there was 2 tiny slices at the front, 1 at the back. This one had 2 at the front, and then a single layer pretty much along that whole join. It isn't perfect, but perfection wasn't on the cards. It is very close though, and well within reach of relatively simple filling and sanding, and the fins are added. These are in 2 halves, but it's moulded with the leading and trailing edges solid, and then the separate half sort of sits inboard, and the join goes around there. It's not terrible, it is visible, but it's not terrible. I think a little bit of Mr. Surfacer rubbed off with a cotton bud will do there. We've also added this sort of, this is 2 parts here. There is again a join in the middle of those, which I'm not sure is meant to be there, but again it's pretty reasonable. So that's our upper fuselage. We've added these lumps too. Then the lower fuselage, I've removed all of the sort of random sprue braces, sorry, there was lots and lots of braces all over the place. I've taken all of those out and cleaned everything up. There was a bit of flash in in the edges of things. I've cleaned that up as well, and there's a little bit still left on this corner of this intake, along with the sink mark you can see there, which I'll probably just tidy up that leading edge, thin it down just a touch, just sharpen it up a little bit. As with so many modern kits, the mould seams run along the edges of things nowadays, and it's quite apparent here. Well, it's going to be really hard for me to get it so you can see it on the footage, to be honest, but I can't tell on the small screen whether this is going to show, but I'll give it a go. So up this edge you can see there's some sort of lumps and bumps, and there's a bit of flash. You can hear it all up that edge, and that's because the mould seam is right on that corner there. So what you need to do is get a sanding stick in there. I'm getting myself in shadow again, aren't I? Get a sanding stick in here and just clean that off, which at the same time will just tidy up that leading edge a touch. This side's a lot cleaner, but there is still a little bit all right at the top here, and this sort of, it's not flash, but it's a mould seam and it needs cleaning. And then moving on to this step here, I've got the lower wing portions, and I have drilled the holes. I'm going to go beast mode. You do pretty much have to decide right now where you want to go with your complete build. So you have options here. You can see here where it's move that there. Noting to take out all these braces that were all over it, get rid of those and clean up the stubs. Here, open holes for the gun pod. I don't want the gun pod, so I'm not going to. And on the wings, open holes for pylons. So if you want to fit the pylons, aka beast mode, you need to take these holes out, flashed over holes. I used a 1.2mm drill bit in the outboard pylon holes and a 1.5 on the inboards, and then just tickled them with a file to get them all the way open. At this stage you don't have to choose whether you have an open or closed weapons bay, but I am going to have a closed weapons bay. I want to have the lift fan and the nozzle set in the landing configuration, so I don't want to make it look even more objectionable and messy by having an open weapons bay as well. And I think with the beast mode option there'll be enough interest from weapons without the weapons bay being open as well. Alright, so the last few instruction steps, that's 6, 7 and 8, have been dealing with the undercarriage and weapons bays, as you see here, and here they are all done. So we've got the 2 weapons bays. So unlike the A and the Tamiya kit, this doesn't have one big weapons bay, it's split down the middle. All that extra gubbins for the vertical takeoff gear obviously gets in the way. So here are said weapons bays, and this is how they come. So 2 parts make up the actual bay, and each one has a pylon in it, and this one has got some pipelines as well. That's those. Nose undercarriage bay made up of several parts: sides, front, rear and roof. The leg is trapped in there. Now if you were to elongate the pins here, so instead of these holes, if you brought the hole all the way to the bottom, you may, at least on one side, you may be able to slot the leg in afterwards. I've not tested that, but in theory that would work. So if you take this aperture here and bring it all the way to the top so it makes it into a slot, then you should be able to sort of angle the leg in once the base fitted to the model. As I say, I didn't bother doing that. I have done that before on others though. So you've got the leg, which is one piece, and a couple, you've got a retraction strut and another strut at the back here that just goes up into the roof. Nose wheel steering motor, and actually the lamp. The lamp, as you can see, I make it twinkle in the light. I've actually coloured that in a chrome finish with this AK chrome pen. This is really brilliant. I bought one of those Molotow chrome pens, which worked fabulously the first 2.5 times I used it, and ever since then has just given a vaguely metallic silver. It's a bit disappointing, but this one so far so good. Same kind of deal. You just use it like a felt tip, and this is the finish you get. Seeing that? Whoops! Always dropping things. There you go. Glint, glint. Mirror finish. So that was painted in. I built these last night. That's been left to dry, and I'll just pop the lens in using some white glue so it doesn't damage that finish. Obviously I've done that because I want to paint this later, and if I add the lens I won't then be able to paint behind it. So that's the nose bay. As you can see, quite a lot of, I think most if not all of this detail is kind of fairly random and made up, but it looks relatively busy. So, and then the 2 main undercarriage bays, relatively lacklustre compared to the nose. This, again, just a standard looking detail. It's not amazing. The leg itself is quite nice. It's one piece. It's very sturdy, again with 2 sort of retraction arms on it, and again fitted before this is fitted to the model. But in this case there's not really any good reason why you could not fit the leg after you fit the undercarriage bay, if that's what you wanted to do. Then the lower portion of the fuselage, then here it is. I have added this louvered panel and these 2 infills here. The louvered panel fits perfectly well, but I did have to clean up each and every one of these slats because they had flash on them that made them look uneven, and that was both at this edge and this edge, so that took a few minutes, but that's all in situ. So the next job is actually to fit all of these bays to this lower fuselage. So I'll just do one while you're with me. So we'll just position it in. It's got tabs and notches for locating it. There we go, that is it in situ. So once it's in place and everything's flush and you can see it's fitting, we'll just get the old extra thin out. And I have a fairly loaded brush there. I wouldn't normally use that much to put something in, but I want this to flow quite well. I'll pull this in here. Just give it a little squeeze to make sure it's in. And then when you flip it over, what is immediately obvious is this big area along here. It doesn't really touch, and it looks a bit rubbish. Now I'm going to assume that later on when we fit the doors, if you were to fit them either open or closed, that it'll certainly cover that if you fit them in the closed option, and I suspect if you fit the open option it'll sit in that. But as it is there, it looks a little bit untidy. Let's pop the undercarriage bay in as well, and again here I did have to clean up various bits of flash on these edges. So this one drops through. It's got two small locating ledges, front and rear, and again a little bit more glue than I would normally put on anything. Front and rear, just flood that into where we want the glue to be. And just like the weapon bay, it sort of fits where it touches along this edge. It doesn't really seal it out properly. And again, I do believe that will be covered by the doors when fitted. But there you go. When you can see as these start to go in, it starts to build up quite an impressively detailed look. Whether it's accurate or not, it does look relatively impressive, does it not? I'll continue putting these in. As you saw there, no trouble with that. They've all just slotted into place, and it is starting to look quite impressive. So the very next part of construction, after adding all those bays to the lower fuselage, is the lift fan. Just these parts here. So there's a couple of points to raise with these. So this is the sort of lower duct trunking, if you like, for this assembly, and there's a lot of nonsense in these parts, so just try and angle it. See that big chunk of I don't know what going up there, big lump of mess. Some very prominent ejector pins, and then on this side some just random lumps, all a bit pants, not really good enough. I'm not sure if those lumps are supposed to be there, but both the sides of this have them, but they don't really look like anything. They're not equally spaced or anything. They don't look like they're supposed to be there. They look a bit rubbish. Also, it's got a sort of a notched join, so you've got a cut out here and a tab here, which means should you want to clean this up properly, be just a tiny bit more work, but these lumps need to go, and obviously on this aft face. Just great big, just rubbish. No idea why they're like that, but that needs cleaning up too. Now the ejector pins, I think, honestly, you can probably get away with, but that crap I'm going to have to clear it out. Just to show how that looks, here's the lower half, and this louvered panel under here is where this goes. So when you pop that into position, this is where everything's just not going to play along. So I'm trying to video and show. When you place it into position, you can see up into here. Not super well, but you absolutely can see, and especially actually that forward face with its weird lumps. It's quite visible now, and when painted white will only be more so. So, you know, if you're wanting to build a high quality model, this thing will have to be cleaned up. So the construction of it, this lower face and this most excellent, it's like a guide vane assembly, go together like so, and that is trapped within the duct. You cannot fit this after. In fact, that piece of flash or whatever is actually getting in the way there. You can't fit this after the thing is joined together, so the best you're going to be able to do really is probably clean up this part of the joint, but just to show you that may be necessary. And as I said at the beginning, I do want to make an actual finished model out of this. This is one area where I am going to have to just go to one side and paint and assemble these parts properly before I fit them into the model. So apologies for that. There will be a big splash of colour on that when it's done, but I need to do it. There's no way I can effectively paint all this afterwards. The other point to note here on the instructions, you'll see that everything is labelled to be coloured in either G or C. So, you know, logic would lead you to think that maybe G might be white and C might be silver or some such. When I went and had a look at the paint guide, C is flat insignia yellow. Yeah, don't think so. So I did a quick bit of Googling. I don't have any reference information on the F-35, and I've never seen a real one up close. But just for reference, here's something I found on Google. There's not much on Google. This is quite a heavily guarded aircraft still, but clearly none of this is yellow. So, so I'm going to go with white for the ducts and various metallic tones for the fans themselves, and the exterior of this duct, which is also visible through, when we're done, will be visible through this aperture here. The exterior of it I'll do in a dull aluminium or maybe a grey, as befits an internal bit of hardware. But that's what we're looking at. So this is the louver and the intake part of the lift fan. There you go. So here is the lift fan all painted. As you can see, I've just used different bits and bobs of metallics here and there. From underneath, it's white, the silver aluminium coloured fan, and this sort of guide vane thing, and then I painted the cap of that grey just for the sake of it, really. So that's that, and that sits on top of there. And if I show it to you now, it's all glued together and it'll do as it's told. You can see how you can see it relatively clearly through that louvered exit panel, and you can obviously see the joint line quite clearly as well if you're looking for it. So moving on from that, we put together, you can see the step there. This is the part of, well, it's the engine obviously. Again, I've just randomly coloured it in. This is Alclad steel, this is AK's duralumin with other mixtures of things there, and that slips through or into this bulkhead, which is Alclad white aluminium. All just different colours for effect, really. Just sits in here, like so. And this is the drive shaft, I suppose, for want of any better name for it, which goes between the two. Thus, obviously easier to do when you use adhesive. That slipped out in the bottom. But the final piece of this particular puzzle is actually the intake. So that's down here. You can see this has to go through the intake and connect the two, so that's going to be a bit of a faff, isn't it? But before I get there, I have to assemble the intake. It's made out of these 4 parts, and this is the inside, and it's clean enough. There's some crap going on the outside, but that doesn't matter. The inside is smooth. On these longer parts, we do have some exciting ejector pin marks here and here, but this is the part here that you'll see from the front, and there are no ejection pins there. But despite that, get this the right way around. This a minute while I figure out which one goes where again. None of it makes sense, honestly. There we go. There. So when you look down it, no ejector pins, it's all good, but there is a seam. I can't get the light and the angle. There is a seam there. It's not horrendous and would be intensely difficult to get rid of because it's right in this top corner. The rest of it you can't really see. And this then continues on and attaches down here like so. That bifurcated duct, and this part lines up with the second hole here, so you can see straight down into there, and you can see that seam in the bottom quite happily. And then the engine's just going to be back here, so you'll be able to see that drive shaft. That will to some extent hide that seam, but if you want true excellence, once this is assembled, you're going to have to deal with this seam at least here, and to make that even easier, Italeri have moulded these tabs as chunks, so they'll need to be got rid of as well. So yeah, for best results, at the very least, this bottom seam, which is very visible, will have to be dealt with, but at least it's a relatively easy one to deal with. For the rest of it, especially when you're talking in terms of wanting effective painting, really it's going to have to be painted before it's put together, or at least the front end. So that's that, and I've just got to hope it all fits together really, because it's quite a, so that'll fit around this, and then join up with the intakes and the engine. But I'll get it together. Again, I'm going to have to paint the insides of these parts, but we'll get it together and see how it all works. Alrighty then, so engine itself with its bulkhead. I don't think this needed to be painted, or at least not all of it. I think I may be proven wrong as the build progresses. I think this area behind this bulkhead is probably best to have painted, because it's quite open around here, because we'll have that twirled down exhaust duct. But this part absolutely doesn't need to be painted at all. It's probably best if the front faces though. Now the instructions are rather glibly as ever, just to show you attaching the drive shaft between the engine and the fan unit via the duct, and then somehow just wiggling it all into place on the model. I think it will be simplified with the addition of glue, but trying to line it all up by hand is monumentally difficult. So I think I've test fitted backwards and forwards quite a lot. I think what I'm going to do is glue the intake to the engine. I can then post the drive shaft through the hole and cement it into the front face of the engine. and then I can just kind of wiggle it the rest of the way. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do. The fit of the intakes by themselves seems okay. I'm going to reserve full and final judgment until the upper half is affixed on this fuselage, but it seems like the fit here isn't the best, let's say, but you can see there's quite a bit of movement in that forward fuselage at this point because there's not much meat in it. The left side does fit better than the right, so I don't think that we want to be flexing that into place. So I am going to just fiddle about a little bit more and see if I can improve it any. The fit up in this area is reasonable, and it sort of sits behind the moulded in step. You can see that moulded in ledge here, and it sits behind that, as in it's lower down, so you won't see a step because the step's facing away from you, but it looks like it fits okay there, but not so much there. So yeah, I'm going to glue it and the engine together, fiddle about with that, and I'll come back with my results. Now, as promised, I've glued in the back, so this is just glued across the bulkhead here. That's holding the engine steady. Before I did that, I glued the intake to the engine, so that's all one, and we glued at the front as well. As you can see, the drive shaft is in there and it's glued into the front of the engine, but it's not moving much because it's glued, but it's just hanging here. So I've glued it and held it down at the front, and I don't know if my lights are gonna play the game, but as you can see, there is a sort of a gap, if you like, but the beginning of the intake sits behind the edge of that gap, so from the front it isn't really evident, and you won't be able to see it from this angle with the fuselage on. You see that this fit here is still a little bit on the shonky side, but it will push up, and I'm going to do that once the upper fuselage is on. As part of gluing that together, I'll bring these together because I don't want to throw the whole joint out of whack potentially to get that in. But that is all in and it's solid, and it does fit creditably well. And when one offers the lid into the proceedings and get it in the right place, you can see that whole vent and duct area lines up nicely as well. And not only that, when viewed from the top, that drive shaft neatly hides the seam that's in the duct itself. In fact, it's quite hard to see it from any angle now that the fuselage top is on, so that's good. Yeah, so what I then did was I found with everything set up thus, you can slip the lift fan itself down into position, but there isn't enough wiggle room with the drive shaft to get it in here whilst doing so, and you can't angle it because of the nose wheel bay. So what I did was I cheated and I cut the bottom out of this hole. So now I can just drop the lift fan into place like so, and it just drops down over the beginning of that drive shaft. Now truthfully, it doesn't matter, you can't see it from here, you can't see it from here, so actually you could cut that whole thing off and it wouldn't matter, because you can only see through here that the drive shaft disappears through a hole. You can't tell what it attaches to, so that's a perfectly valid solution in my book. So I'm just going to glue this lift fan ducting into place now. It's not all that much gluing area for this, to be honest. It sort of just rests on top of the little louver panel. But there you go, that's now glued in. And if we offer up the upper fuselage again, you can see how that aligns very neatly with the cutout for it in the top. click, click. Now, it's obvious straight away now that I've done that, that flexing in this lower nose profile is perfectly fine. It needs to flex up anyway, so we can bring that joint together whilst all this is gluing, and it's not going to be an issue. Same this side. So I shall get on and start gluing that on, because that is the next step. We've got to put these vertical panels in at the back, and then we're going to glue the two together. So if anything dramatic comes up, I'll come back whilst I'm doing that and explain myself. Okay, I have the upper and lower fuselage halves joined, and mostly it's actually very, very good. I'll just nip round it with you. So at the back, most of the joints are sort of right on these sort of chines, these corners, and when that's done well, it can really almost disappear a seam just with some glue. And here you can see it's pretty darn good. It will need some work to be invisible, but certainly not a lot, and probably not really any actual filler. Pretty much the same story along here. Now these corners on the real thing are quite sharp, so I think this sort of flat face that Italeri have given it isn't entirely prototypical, so you probably want to sharpen that up a bit anyway. Same deal on this side. This one overhangs a bit. It's hard to see it, but there's a bit of a step there, but again, because it's on a corner the way it is, it's quite easy to deal with that. Everything fits nicely in the back there. It's all joined up together properly. There is a bit of a step here. Those vertical panels that I added in, there's a bit of a step there. There was a triangle. Both sides had it, a triangle, a flash that went across that bottom corner, which stopped this panel from sitting flush with this one. So I trimmed that away, but even with that gone, there is still a bit of a step there. Where were we? This side up front, same deal, pretty decent. But the very nose of it, not so much. And obviously, a big problem with this is going to be all this tape detail. Love it or loathe it, what it will do right now is get in the way. To fix this seam wouldn't be overly difficult, honestly, if it weren't for the proximity of all this raised nasty detail. Trouble is, if you start saying, oh, I'll take that off, you've got to reinstate it somehow, because it's all over the rest of the model. But I'll come up a bit closer. This side is the better of the two. If I get my tweezers, this sits a little low, so it's a little low both along this top edge and here, but it's not really possible to get in there with anything to spread it wider, or you can't really do a lot about it. Well, I couldn't anyway. So that's about as good as it gets, and I glued this simply by just going bit by bit with the liquid cement, putting it in, holding it until it's set, or set up enough to stay anyway. But as you can see, this area here it's not the best. It's not awful, but it's not great, and as I say, because of the proximity of this, it's going to be difficult, a little more difficult to sort it than it would otherwise be. But this side, unfortunately, I mean, I've improved it, don't get me wrong, but you got the same thing. I had a big gap along here, and it required quite a lot of pressure across the joint vertically to get rid of that gap. It could be done, but of course liquid cement won't really hold a joint with a lot of pressure, certainly not quickly, and there wasn't really any way to clamp it other than with my hands without risking damaging things. So it was glued with liquid cement. It's got the same step there and here, and of course this is made even worse this time by the boarding ladder aperture. The detail around that's right in the way. So what I did was used a touch of CA super glue, put it into that joint along here and along here with the sharp cocktail stick, and then I've held it for long enough for it to take. So that's pulled everything together. But as you can see, it's still quite a prominent joint, and obviously there's super glue all over the place as well, which I'll have to sand off anyway. I think this one is going to be an issue, as I say, because of that detail there, but that would be relatively easy to reinstate, more so anyway than this. So that's the joint between the two halves. As you can see, it's all gone together. And overall, bear in mind, this is a pretty optimistic, it's pretty adventurous little sort of system of joints here, and honestly, it's gone together reasonably well. It's not awful, not at all. But it's really starting to come together now, and the next step's going to be adding these lower wing panels. Obviously we drilled these out a few steps back, and they literally do just pop in and butt up to the side of the fuselage area, and again it's creating this large panel line, but there is a sort of a chamfer going away from it, a change in the level, but it's not flush. However, for the sake of an easy life, all I would do, or all I will do later, is just run some Mr. Surfacer or some Vallejo plastic putty into that and just wipe it away with a cotton bud, just to remove the gap more than anything else. And there we go, at the end of stage 15 of the instructions, you have an essentially complete airframe here. I mean, there's still stuff to do, obviously, but the main sort of meat of the build is done here. We're moving on to other stuff. Honestly, it's pretty decent. I mean, I think it's not perfect by a long way, but I think it's better than a Revel kit, or better than some of the recent Revel kits I've had exposure to. Build wise, the moulding is pretty good. There are a few sink marks, I'll point a couple out in a minute. The fit around the nose is a tiny bit shady, but I sort of expected that, looking at the breakdown. It takes Tamiya levels of precision to get that kind of thing absolutely right. And really, there's virtually no one else that can do that than Tamiya, in my experience. So from where you saw it last, we had a look at these seam lines, and the way they've designed this, it's quite nice actually. Almost all the seam lines are now hidden. With the addition of the control surfaces, almost the entire seam down the back here, and obviously the tail planes, is hidden by said control surfaces and tail planes, so you really don't need to put a great deal of effort into that, which really just leaves this section down the side on each side. The wing joint's got to go, as we said earlier, but as you can hopefully tell, I've managed to make that fit pretty well, and it shouldn't be too much bother. All of these control surfaces fit nicely without any problem as well. Just plug the tail planes just plug onto the back end of the fuselage, and the sort of flaperons and the slats have got nice rounded edges, and they slot quite positively into the wing. You might be led to believe, looking at it, that these would be poseable, but they're not really, because underneath you've got this large area here. On the real one, that probably disappears inside when this lowers, but on the kit there's no provision for that to happen, so you can't really deflect these downwards, and they wouldn't look great if you deflected them upwards. Same with the slat. It's got that nice rounded section, but it's also got a flat at the top and the bottom, so you can't really pose it. Sink marks, one on each slat, quite in your face and obvious right in this outboard corner. Both sides have that. Other than that, all the joints, tail planes, and the rest of these parts are sort of along ram lines or sort of natural panel breaks, so if you want to be super serious about it, you can put some Mr. Surface or something in there, just rub it off and it'll be okay. Really not too much effort at all. The nose cone, or radome, to use the correct terminology, I stuck some plasticine in it to add a bit of nose weight. I don't think it needs it. It does sit quite nicely on its 3 legs, but you can't be too careful. I've still got a load of doors and jet pipe stuff to stick right in the back here, and there's not much left to put at the front, so I thought better safe than sorry. I've chucked a bit of plasticine in there just to be sure, maybe 5-10 grams at most. And again, the fit of the radome, it's okay, but it's obviously influenced by the fit of the rest of the forward fuselage, which, as we know, wasn't the best. So again, it's slightly gappy. However, that gap is fully within the remit of Mr. Surfacer or Deluxe Materials plastic putty to just wipe it in and wipe it off. No sanding required. So far, I'm quite happy with the way it's going together. I'm quite enjoying it. It's been an easy build, actually easier than the Rebel Hurricane, in all honesty. But now we get on to lots of nadry things, weapons, bits and pieces, so I'll crack on with that. Weapons then, this is my chosen load. As I said, I'm going for beast mode, but with closed weapons bay doors, so I can only have what's going to hang on the 6 wing pylons. So that is a pair of AIM-9Xs, multiple pieces, but I think actually really quite nice. Funny thing, they've got 2 of the 4 fins are separately moulded and you have to glue them in, and it always seems to be the case to me that the ones that are moulded separately are always a lot thicker than the ones that are part of the missile body already. I find that a bit frustrating because it makes them obvious. Then we've got a pair of GBU 12s. Again, as per, they're in 2 halves. I've not cleaned any of these seams up at all. With, again, 2 of the 4 fins on each being separate. And I do think they look pretty decent as well. And finally, a pair of GBU 31 JDAMs, hashtag Genesis Designs and Modelcraft bombs, which I do think are some of the coolest looking bombs, if you can think bombs look cool, going. So whenever there's JDAMs as part of a build, I'm always quite keen to use them, and not least because they're my initials. Yeah, so that's the weapons. You will end up, if you ape this build, with a heap of spare weapons. I have 4 JDAMs spare, 2 GBUs and 2 AMRAAMs, AIM-120s unused, so they'll be excellent for the spares box. And then moving on to the closing up of the underside, I had low hopes for the weapons bay doors. As you can see, I've got one side done here. These are said doors in their raw form, just snipped off the sprue. There's a million different sprue mounting points there. And in the raw unfettled state, they do fit, but not really. So I did have to do some trimming. The big curved door, the outer door, actually dropped in pretty well, and all it really needed was the sawtooths at each end, just cleaning up. And I simply put you down, used a sanding stick and sort of just went along the edges like so, just neatened everything up, trimmed it back a touch, and that dropped in, as you can see, quite nicely. Again, there are gaps and big joins here and there, but well within the remit of Mr. Surfacer. And then this inner door, with all its curves and shapes, I was quite concerned about, and it didn't fit initially. It wasn't having it. It sat very proud at both ends. It was a touch too long and it wouldn't sit in next to the outer door. So what I did was, my tweezers, I snipped off completely this lump and this lump, and then this end area here, this thickness, I shaved that down to make it as thin as the rest of it, and I did the same thing with this thickness here. Once I had done that, I again used the sanding stick in these ends, trimmed them all back a touch, and once I'd done that it did fit, and this is the result with a little trimming. I don't think that's too bad at all. Bye bye detail. Hello, very curvaceous belly. Continuing on then, so doors. We're starting to make a lot of doors. This thing is just 58 doors flying in close formation seemingly. Initially then, undercarriage. So I've gone with the 4 doors being closed. I haven't researched this, so don't quote me, but I feel like most undercarriage systems, especially on faster aircraft, the doors are designed to close as part of the opening sequence. So once the legs are down, the doors close again. So I've decided to have them closed, and also because I just think it will look slightly nicer. So in order to do that, you have to snip off the hinges. That's fine, I did that. And this is the result. In both cases, both of these doors, the fit's not the best. There's a huge gap here, as you can see. This is gappy. Part of this is due to the angle, so the door sort of sits on the curve and it just doesn't stretch around far enough. So you can see it's a pretty heinous gap through there. The rest of it fits though. You can also see how we ended up with these doors. They're not too bad. It's not perfect, not even close actually, but it's not horrible. And importantly, all of these panels, as much as they're a bit gappy in places, it's all quite level. So if you want to fill it, all you need to do is use perfect plastic putty or similar, and it will take care of those gaps. This one is the same, as you can see. Gappy muck gap face. In fact, I tell you what, I'm going to dig out the perfect putty now and I'm going to show you exactly what I'm on about. I keep going on about it. I think most of you are probably perfectly well aware of what I speak, but just in case anyone isn't, here's what you need. This is the stuff I'm talking of. So I've been talking about Deluxe Materials. They do the same stuff. The one I have is Vallejo plastic putty, and it's kind of like polyfiller. It's very water based. It's quite grainy. It's got a lovely fine applicator. So decide which sort of gap you want to smooth out. Pause for application of scientist goggles. Hold on. Let's go along here. So using the applicator, I'm squeezing the tube and I'm going to go along. Try and make sure you force that putty one way or another in to the gap, not just kind of across the top of it. Okay. Yep, that looks crap, Jen. Now what? Get your cotton bud and moisten it. I just stick it in my mouth, but you can use water if you're precious. You don't want it soaking wet. If it's too wet, it will literally just wash that putty right out. But it needs to be wet enough to pick up that excess neatly. And there you go. Done. It's the work of it would literally take minutes to go around all of this and just get rid of those gaps. It's the appearance of gaps that makes it look untidy. Because they're dark, you can see them really easily against the finish. So you run round, you put the putty in, and then when you paint it, it won't look anywhere near as bad. What you might like to consider doing if you're going to use this process, and especially if you end up filling anything larger, although much bigger than this, and you need to go away from this and actually fill it properly. This is, as I said, a bit like polyfiller, and as such it's quite porous to paint. So if you've got larger areas, you will want to consider using a primer coat. It doesn't necessarily have to be actual primer, but just a coat of paint across it. Let it absorb that paint before you're looking for a final finish, just to save any bother with uneven paint finishes. But that's that. So that's why I'm not particularly concerned about the gappiness of this, because as I say, it's all quite fair, it's just gappy. So vertical landing configuration. Here's my jet pipe, and you can see through the cleverness of Lockheed it's swiveled through 90 degrees. This is 2 parts here, a ring there, jet pipes moulded as one, and you've got a little thing. I'm not going to be able to get the light to show you, but you can clearly see the seam in there, this area. It's got a seam, it's also got ejector pin marks. That may want to be addressed by some modellers, and that simply fits onto the back of the engine, thus. On top of that, you've got these 2 doors, and that's why the jet pipe's not fitted yet, because I'm going to fit the doors first. You've got substantial hinging areas there, and a pin. Just get it all hooked into place, and there's your door. And then moving on from there, we're going on to the rest of the doors here. So we've obviously got an undercarriage bay door, and these are, it turns out, they looked a bit like some sort of very badly moulded flare packs, but they're actually the reaction control system. So the wonderful Harrier had wingtip, tail and nose vents, little puffer jets, or a venting system, so that the exhaust gas could be directed out of them to maintain control in the hover. This has got these, and obviously we have little doors for that. Just glue some hinges on and then they pop in there. No big bother there. The undercarriage doors are the same, but I need to point out that the instructions are incorrect. So it says for this right hand side that you need door, where have we gone, 21 here. This is door 21, but it is clearly the door, excuse me please, for this side. Just be aware of that if you do build this. Alright, so we've reached the end of step 29. The doormobile is on its wheels, but I'll show you all the doors, and to be honest, they do all fit really well. You've got to glue hinges onto all these ones around the nose, but as you can see, they pop into place quite happily. All the doors, the undercarriage bays are done. I've got the doors at the back here. This one is at a different angle to this one, so the how you glue the sort of hinges and everything to the doors is going to have an influence on how they sit. Glued the jet pipe in, as you can see, so there we go. That's all the doors, and then I fitted the wheels. The wheels, they're just pressed on, okay, they're quite a tight fit, but as you can see, hopefully, there's quite a lot of axle before the wheel, and my initial instinct is to actually just trim the axle down so the wheel sits snug to the leg. That seems normal, so I thought I'd better check this, you know, references, and here you go. Nice picture of Royal Air Force F-35s on a carrier, and you can clearly see that the main wheels do need to be snug up to the legs there. So the axles will need to be shortened gradually until the wheels fit snug to the legs, and obviously when they're attached with glue you can ensure that they're straight and not a little bit off like that. So that's the underside pretty much done for now. Let's have a flip. What's next? Oh no, we're going to do all the pylons next, but there you go. All the doors are on for the configuration I have chosen. So just a quick look around there. But yeah, geometry here is a bit off, as you can see. If I make that, there you go. You see one door is hanging a little different to the other, so I'll need to look at changing that somehow. But other than that, it's all gone together quite happily, and stands on its wheels quite happily too, which is nice. And actually, before I wrap this piece up, talking of wheels, they're not bad. The nose wheel was moulded as one, if you recall. The mains are in 2 halves, and the detail hub-wise isn't too bad at all. You've got the hub there, sort of a bit of brake pack stuff there, and as I said previously, they are both flattened and do have a weighted effect. However, the tread The mould, this is in 2 halves. You see I've joined it with liquid glue, but the tread is really indistinct, not very good at all. And also, weirdly, I'll try and angle it so it's showing. Easier said than done. Mine doesn't work very well back to front. There we go. Hopefully, you see the piece that's flattened off here isn't actually flat. It's still got radius to it crosswise, so when that's sat on a stand or whatever, there'll be a gap. It won't look like it's sat on something properly. If it wasn't for the weighted bulging, it wouldn't really matter, because the tyre obviously tucks under as it touches the ground, but that will just look a little bit odd. And unfortunately, if you sand that back until that crown has gone, it's going to be like US, it'll be the world's flattest tyre. So might need a little, well, it's either going to have to be ignored, or buy new wheels, or maybe actually put some filler or something on it. But a bit annoying actually, because the detail on them isn't too bad at all. Beast mode activated. Look at this. So all those weapons I already built are now fitted. The pylons are 3 parts, so there is this third part that fits onto the bottom, which does give a little bit of detail, but it's nowhere near as good as the Academy A10, for example. The outboard pylons are pretty weird because they're bent. If you look from head on, kind of like on a Tomcat or a Tornado or something that's got sort of side pylons for missiles. It's sort of like that, obviously to give space, because not very big wings these in terms of span to get 6 pylons worth of gear onto. So, but the fittings are nice and sturdy. The pylons have got these big flat sort of tangs on them, so it's quite nice to get them easy to get them fitted nicely. Good bit of gluing area, unlike most pylons. So yeah, they've gone on nicely, and I think it does look kind of cool, but I also think it detracts from the lines of the jet quite badly, in a way that shall I say normal aircraft or non-stealth aircraft, it doesn't so much. Don't know, that might be just me. I have persuaded this door at the back to sit more like where it should, just simply by bending it. Don't tell anyone. I just bent it till it fitted right. So that is now, the belly is complete, so we're going to flip him over and then do the rest of the bits on the top, which is essentially just around the lift fan and the canopy, and the entrance ladder cover, because I'm not having that open. So we're pretty much there for the underneath now. Alright, so we've hit a snag, and now I've turned it over to the top side. The ladder. So I decided way back that I didn't want an extended ladder. There's enough stuff hanging off and hanging open already. I didn't want that as well. So I wanted to go for the closed version as seen here, which requires you to snip the hinges off the door and to fit the door into the aperture. Now the problem I've come up against is, way back here at step 9, as you can clearly see here, it says fixed part 16 Echo, only for extended ladder version, brackets C phase 32. So I did not check phase 32 at this point. I read that statement and omitted part 16E because it says only for extended ladder version. The issue with that is, when you come to fit the panel, the closed panel, the panel in the closed position at this stage of the build, what you've got without part 16E being in place is a ruddy great hole here, which means when you try to fit the panel, it's very prone and very likely to fall straight inside, and then you're going to have to faff about trying to tip it out. And with all the ducting and everything else that's actually inside this thing, it could easily get stuck and never be seen again. This is clearly not ideal. So Genesis top tip number 238 is blue tack. You can use plasticine for this as well. I did not use plasticine because it is prone over time to drying out and shrinking a little, and then it would rattle around inside there and be thoroughly irritating. Blue tack is less prone to doing that, so I raided the extra thin blue tack stash, and I've stuck a big wodge of blue tack in here to take up that space, so that when I offer up this closed panel, it can sit on that blue tack. There's no danger of the panel falling inside the model. It can sit there, I can position it, and then I can press it in using the blue tack as a cushion. I've gone off camera, I'm sorry. I can press it in until I get it as flush as it will go, like that, and then I can add glue around the outside without any danger of any issues at all. So that's the way to get around that issue if, like me, you believe the instructions and just follow them. I should know better, shouldn't I? But there's your heads up that actually what you want to do with this closed panel is fit part 16E, because that provides a backing surface, or fit the panel before you close up the fuselage half, so that you can put some scrap plastic card or something in the back, in the back here, for that door to rest on, and have that all fitted and fair before you even fit the fuselage halves together. Now I would normally do that on a build anyway. That's the way I tend to work things. If I know I'm going to have a closed panel, I'll fit it earlier so that I can get to both sides and get it as flush and well fitting as I can. The reason I didn't do that by default on this build is because I'm following the instructions for exactly reasons like this, to highlight where they might have part numbers switched over, as they have done in a few places, or things like this. And on the subject of part numbers, the outboard pylons here, 4C and 1C, those were reversed as well in the instructions from what they actually fit to, so forgot to mention that with the weapons segment. So there you go, top tip, use blue tack as a backing for things like this. You could, if you wanted to, obviously cut slivers of plastic card and sort of insert them to provide a shelf, but that would be fiddly, and sticking a big glob of blue tack in there really isn't. It's nice and easy. So I'm going to go for a closed canopy, and this canopy has 5 attachment points, and all of them are quite juicy ones. And obviously the problem with transparent plastic in most cases, and this is one of them, is it's quite relatively brittle compared to coloured plastic. So if you try to snip these attachment points off properly close to the part, like you would with a normal plastic part, you can introduce crazing and cavities where you cut the sprue point off. So what I do to combat that is drop the canopy on the floor a lot. Now what I do is deliberately snip the attachments slightly further away, as you can see there, and then trim it back with my scalpel. This is a sharp, basically new blade. Be patient, be gentle. Obviously it would be quite easy at this stage for me to sort of snap this thing in two. Just trim that attachment point away gradually, carefully, and you can get, as I've done this one at the front here, to the point where it's completely invisible. You may be able to see a shiny spot in that textured area where I've trimmed that away, just with the scalpel, no sanding required. If you want to use a sanding stick, of course, it's an option, but I hate the way the sanding residue sticks to everything with the static with clear parts, and I like to try and keep it, as much of it away from that as possible. The other thing with this, if anyone watching this also watched a review, you might remember there was some scuffing here from the packaging. That is still present, but what I've done with that is I've given it a buff with my t-shirt, nothing else, just my t-shirt, normal t-shirt material t-shirt, and that has done a really good job of mitigating it, but it is still there. So one thing you can do to sort of really get rid of things like that and completely restore clarity, I'll show you now. So wax. This I got from Hero Boy. It's part of the Zero Paints range. It's just carnauba wax. You can use sort of wax polishes that are designed for vehicles. You've probably got something in your garage that would be completely suitable for this. But what I would say is please, please, please test if you're going to use sort of an automotive finishing material. Test it on a spare part or on a piece of the frame runner first, because some of them have got additives in which will actually craze things like this because it's not strong enough. But yeah, this is just pure carnauba wax. Now I use a cotton bud. You don't have to, you can use a cloth, but I use a cotton bud because I can apply it exactly and only where I want it, that way. And I'm just rubbing that in where that little cloud of scratches was. And despite the appearance of a frame in the middle here, that's actually internal, so there's not an impediment here. Now, this being pure carnauba wax without additives, it isn't going to polish those scuffs away. If you use something like T-cut or T-cut style or one of the slightly more abrasive automotive waxes, you can polish those tiny scratches away. What this is actually going to do rather than that is fill them in. Let it dry for a moment, and then get a soft cloth. This is just a cheap one from Asda. Buff it off, and lo and behold, no more cloudy patch on the canopy. This is also a good way of using the wax like this. It is a good way of restoring full clarity after you've been painting the frames and everything else. You'll sometimes get that little bit of sort of cloudiness, maybe from a tiny bit of overspray or the sort of sticky residue from tape, that kind of stuff. Give it a little polish with some wax, just gently with a cotton bud, and it'll get rid of it all and give you that good shine back. So, assembling the canopies. This kit, like a lot of more modern kits actually, the manufacturers are starting to include internals for canopies, which is great because they're a thing on real aircraft. So this forward piece and two side pieces, so that is, let me move these pieces, dropped in just fine. The way I aligned the front one, because it's not super positive, is I placed it, get you in shot, Jet, placed it on the front here and put a little bit of ultra glue on top of it, and then popped the canopy down into position, and that just squeezed it into the correct place for it to go. Once it was there, I left it for a couple of minutes to let the ultra glue sort of tack up, and then pop it off and just really carefully apply a bit of extra thin into the corners, which will hold it for good. The ultra glue is good, but it isn't what you'd call permanent really. Same deal with the sides. They sit into position quite positively, and I've used a little bit of extra thin along the bottom. Do use extra thin on transparencies, guys. Don't be afraid to use it, but be careful. Don't use a lot. And then you come to these two parts here. So we've got just a simple frame with a bit of photo etch added to it, and then another frame. So this one goes at the back. It's got a bunch of detail on it. Please focus, I thank you, which faces aft. And this might seem crazy, but that is because if you fit the canopy in the open position, it tips from the front, so that area becomes very visible. I'm having it closed, so it doesn't matter to me, but my beef with this, it fits fine, is these two super prominent ejection pin marks and sink marks on the front face, so it will be completely visible through the rest of the canopy. Annoying. And then this one, this brace arch, whatever you want to call it, frame, also has, get it in my tweezers, there you go, a large moulding floor at the top there, and the PE part, which is designed to be glued to the bottom of it, you can see it's in situ there, maybe, that provides grab handles. It is too long. I hope, yes, you can see that overhanging. I'm going to have to trim that off. It isn't the end of the world, but it's annoying. This piece of photo etch has one job, which is to fit on the inside of this arch, and it's the wrong size. Now, because I've perhaps rather stupidly taken it as read that it would fit, I've glued it from one end and worked my way around, and hence my handles are now not level, but I feel that that won't be super visible. I will trim that excess off. Once that's done, this part, there is a recess here. This frame is a recess. It clips into there and sits in the notches in these two rails. Sits there quite happily. I won't need glue, which is nice because you don't run the risk of any sort of visible blemishes that way. You can just tack it in place with a tiny bit of extra thin in the bottom at each side. Bearing in mind that I do want to paint this and have a finished model at the end of it, I think I will fill this front face with some super glue before I attach it, so again there'll be a slightly visible bit of work done here, but it needs to be doing, and I will trim this scarring off of here as well. And there it was done. The canopy's fitted and it fits okay. There's a little bit of a gap at the front, which I'll show you in a minute, but it basically fits. And then the last step was pitos, and then these doors here as shown there. No major issues with any of that. The hinges for the main door, this door here, so these hinges are moulded in as part of the inner part, the inner section of this door, and I found that to enable it to come forward onto the jacks properly, I had to chamfer the top inner edge of the hinges to let it come forward a little bit more. But it's quite a solid, robust fit actually when it's in. And that's all there is to say about that really. No stupid ejector pin marks there. We covered that. The pitos you can see down here at the bottom. Stealth pitos, that must have been a job, right? So that's that, and there it is, it's done. So, reflecting, let me just show you these parts. So the canopy, don't know if it's really going to come through, and because it's transparent it's hard to see, but right at the very front edge, there's a bit of a gap. That's just falling back because it's only held in with the ammo glue and it won't have set yet. Pitos down the front there. They're not really positively located, they just kind of sit in the front, and they do angle down quite substantially. And then you've got your lift fan doors. So yeah, like I said, this thing is, there's not really many places left to hold it now. So many doors. Yeah. Crazy vectoring nozzle. It's really, really clever the way they've done that. I'd like to think, I hope I'm not the only I'm going to make myself sound like an idiot now. I'd like to think it makes a transformer noise when it goes down like that, but maybe I'm an idiot, probably. So yeah, here we go, it's done, and not really a difficult build and all said and done. And we go underneath again. The only slightly problematic areas fit wise was this joint here around the nose. It needed a lot of pressure to join together nicely, but it has joined together fairly nicely with that pressure. I don't know if there was something inside that could have been trimmed to fix it. I wasn't moved to check because it wasn't that bad, and it did pull together. It wasn't making nasty creaking sounds or anything, so I don't think there was anything wrong. I think it was just tight. So yeah, things I am a fan of. The parts breakdown, the ease of assembly are good. It's relatively uncomplicated as a build for a modern jet aircraft. It certainly could have been more complicated, I think. Things I'm not a fan of: flash, mould seams, fit is a little bit indifferent in places. The ram detail, I'm going to just call it ram detail. I'm not sure that's specifically the correct thing to call it, but it's way too pronounced in some places. On the top here, it's not actually that bad, but around the nose, that's just nasty. Now, I said in the initial review that I felt it was overdone, overstated, and it is, but worse than that is the sharpness of it. So I've looked at photos of the real thing throughout this build just for little bits and bobs of clarification here and there, because the instructions ultimately are a little bit vague in a few areas. Like for instance the pitos, it shows you where they fit but not at what angle they fit. They're handed and they're chamfered, so some assistance was required there. Likewise, all these doors, there's no information as to the specific angles that they're supposed to lean at. So I have looked at photos throughout, and yeah, the ram tape or the joint fairing tape is quite prominent. It's there's a thickness to it, but what there isn't is a sharp edge. It blends into the surface because at the end of the day the whole point of it is to provide a smooth surface to avoid radar reflection off the panel gaps. So this is, with the exception of this area here, far too pronounced and far too sharp edged everywhere, but especially around this area, both sides. It's just horrid. Radome fit is mediocre. We've got some gaps around the undercarriage panels, the bomb bay doors, to be expected I think to a degree, but they're there. But with the exception of this nose area and potentially slightly around the radome, all of it is within reach of either Mr. Surfacer or the Vallejo plastic putty style of filling. So there it is. Yeah, as I say, quite an easy build, quite a pleasant build. And I'll let you into a secret now, because as I said at the beginning, I do want to paint this and make a finished model out of it, because £60 out of my budget is too much to spend on a model that is going to end up sat on the side forever unpainted like this bad boy. I was confident that I could finish the cockpit area through the aperture provided without the canopy in the way, and I think I can. And as I said at the start, I've painted a few areas that I knew that I wouldn't be able to effectively finish once the model was together. But on top of that, I've done the assembly of the fins, the tails, all of the weapons, all of the doors and the canopy with this stuff. Yeah, so this is, as you can see, pretty good stuff, because all of this stuff is hanging in place, all these parts, just for this. So once I've finished the video, I can gently remove these parts again, gain access, do my painting, and then put it all back together again. So props to Ammo's Ultra Glue, very very handy. I know this isn't what it's designed for, but it's super useful in this instance, so that I could put this together. And in fact, it's even better than using liquid glue in a way, because it removes the opportunity for parts to be squeezed together, which sometimes a little bit of liquid glue in a joint and a good squeeze can alleviate a fit issue with small bits of surface deviations, but Ultra Glue won't. So if there are bad fit issues, they're even more obvious when you use that. But as you can see, they really aren't particularly. The nose is the only place, and it's not terrible, let's be honest. So do I think it's worth the purchase price? Well, just barely is going to be my honest response to that. I obviously can't usefully review the decals this way. I do have a plan for the finish, and it does not involve these decals, so they'll never get a review as such, but actually I will use the stencils. But they're printed by Cartograph, so I really can't see there being any issues with these decals. Also, and I know it's not the major reason anybody buys a kit, but there are quite a lot of leftover armaments here. What have we got? 4 JDAMs, 2 AMRAMs and 2 GBU 12s spare. There's 2 gun pods, although I don't know if they're any use for anything else. And the weapons trolley, I haven't bothered making it. I have no interest or requirement for it, but there is the parts are included in the kit to build a little trolley you can mount some of that spare weaponry on should you choose to. So there it is there. If the modeler wanted, you could not go beast mode and instead put some weapons on a trolley for visual interest. That would be a valid choice, I think. So yeah, there we have it. The Italeri 148th F-35B Bare Naked Build 2. There will be another video on this model. It won't be a bare naked video, but it'll be a video about the finishing of it, which will commence shortly. And I'll maybe even release them both at the same time. So yeah, I'm happy. It's been a nice build, an easier build than that Rebel Hurricane actually, a faster build, and I think the finished product is pretty decent. I think it's pretty much worth the money. It's quite heavy, there's a lot of plastic here. It certainly could have been more expensive if it were one of the other manufacturers. I think in terms of where this is sitting in the hierarchy of model manufacturers, it's not that high. I'd put it down there with Revell. I think Airfix would have done a better job with this model, and I know for a fact companies like Edward, ICM, Zvezda, Tamiya would have. But on the other hand, they're probably going to be more expensive. £60 in today's market for a kit like this isn't ridiculous, I don't think. So there we have it. Bare Naked Build 2 done and dusted. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope it's been useful to you, whether or not you're going to build this kit. Tune in for the part where I paint it. And I'd like to deviate slightly from the script here. I often point out that you as subscribers and viewers can support my efforts via Buy Me a Coffee, but I always forget to say thank you to the ones that actually do and have. So those guys, you know who you are. Thank you so much for your support so far. It means a lot. It means an awful lot. And if anybody, as I say, does want to support the channel directly, the Buy Me a Coffee link will be provided below. So with that said, it only remains for me to say, look after yourselves, look after each other, and check this out.